Hello and welcome to the East Anglia Hobbit Community Podcast. This week is just me, CJ, and we've got a guest, James Willson. Say hello, James.
Hello.
So we wanted to have a look at the models that were in this game, which are from the books, not included in the films, or maybe from the wider lore altogether, such as Cirion or Eorl the Young. And James is a Tolkien pub quiz winner. We were at Ardicon last year. And basically, off the strength of him alone, we came half a point behind the winning team from Team Knots.
Yes, I think Tolkien nerd is probably the nicest way I would describe myself.
Okie dokie. So just a quick little warm-up. 5 questions from the pub quiz I was at last week from my local nerdy bar. What colour are Tom Bombadil's boots?
His boots are yellow.
They are indeed. What was the name of Theoden's father?
Theoden was the son of Thengel.
Yep. What were the name of the horses that Eomer lent to Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli?
I think they were called Hasselfur and Arod.
That's correct. Which Ent was set ablaze at the Battle of Isengard?
He would be Beachbone.
And for 5 and a clean sweep, what year did the Third Age end?
The Third Age of Middle-earth, if I can remember right, ends around, I think it's 3441?
3019 is the...
Stand corrected, 3441 is the Second Age of Middle-earth.
Mm-hmm.
16 is the Third Age of Middle-earth. Getting my ages confused there.
That's all right. I've got a question about the Second Age coming up later where we'll discuss the Amazon series and what we can expect from it. But you see, James basically is the one that we ride on the coattails of to pub quiz success. So we're going to start with the characters in the game. What are your favourite profiles in the Middle-earth strategy battle game that are not from the movies?
I think if you had to ask me my absolute favourites, I've always been a massive fan of Gondor, so I think first and foremost the fiefdoms troops, because they look absolutely beautiful. As models, and then you actually get into the profiles, and especially with the new way that they can confer army bonuses onto the various troops. So it's like each specific leader. So you've got Imrahil gives Dol Amroth a boost, Forlong gives the Axemen of Lossarnach a boost. You've got Angor the Fearless gives Clansmen a boost. I think Gungnir gives the Black Vale Archers a boost. So it's really nice how fiefdom factions all tie together into a single army. So that's
at high points values, they can be grim the way they all combine.
Exactly, yeah. I'll honestly say I've never seen an army list written that's been purely fiefdoms. I've seen army lists where they'll take an army, it's got Knights of the Lamroth in it, but then you might have a contingent of, say, Knights of Minas Tirith. But I've never actually seen someone take an army to a tournament where they're only ever exclusively using fiefdoms troops. So you have... I think that's an army that has got potential, because obviously you've got Dol Amroth for the cavalry, you've got the Bowmen of Morthon for archery, and then for just regular troops, you've got the Clansmen and the Axemen. So it's a very varied list. So it can hit hard, but it can also put up a defence, especially if you were to take, say, for example, the Knights of the Lamroth on foot and then pike blocks of men-at-arms. That's quite a nasty combination. Plus, as well, if you then factor in someone like Imrahil, I think confers the banner, and then obviously there's fight value bonuses as well. Mm-hmm. Then you factor in the heroes as well. It's a very, very versatile army list. So that's one of the great things.
Yeah, fight 5 pipe block with reroll 1s to wound.
Yes, that's pretty nasty.
Well, we thought for this first lore in-depth discussion that we'd go for the Gondor at War supplement, because that's the most recent. So we're only 8 months out of date. But I thought we'd have a look at the new heroes that were brought in for the good side first. So I've got written down Ingold, Iolus, Hurin, Deowine, and Elfhelm. What can you tell us about them from the books?
Ingold is he's one of the characters we just very briefly introduced to at the start of Return of the King, where if you haven't read The Return of the King, it's different from the films in that Gondor itself, so Minas Tirith and the Pelennor Fields, it's enclosed by a giant wall, the Ramas Ekor. And so you kind of get, like right at the start of Return of the King, Gandalf and Pippin arrive at that wall, and they're basically introduced to Ingold. And that's the only introduction we actually get to him in the book. So it's kind of like he's helping to repair the defences. So he's kind of, he's not really covered any more past that in the books. He's just like, and that's what's great about all these characters who are in the game itself. They get a brief introduction in the book. And obviously, the Middle Earth team, Jay and Rob, and like Sculptors at Forge World, Keith and that lot, they've basically seen these characters and think, we don't have much information for these characters. We have a basic background to them. So they've taken Ingold as, okay, so we know he's on the Ramas at the start of the book. So we could assume he's like a captain who defends the Ramas Ekor. So they've kind of given him, they've essentially made him like a proper defender of Gondor. So like especially with his profile that they don't back away. They're within 3 inches of Ingold. It's literally like he's designed to. It's literally like the wall itself. He's not designed to move. So that's a clever way of doing it.
So this wall of Ramas Ekor, that's like a big circle that stretches out as far as the Osgiliath, the Pelennor River? It
doesn't quite reach Osgiliath, but it does reach... Essentially, it loops around the Pelennor Fields, and also it pretty much encloses Minas Tirith in like a giant ring. So it's like it's an ancient defense, but I can see why they didn't add that in the films, because it probably would just make things complicated. It's kind of like, how did the Rohirrim... Because then you have to go through the whole Rohirrim getting through the woods, and then you've got to introduce the wild men, because they're key to that part of the story. So, again, we're kind of going off into the film tangent here, but you can kind of see why certain things get cut out. I think it's just to save time, really. But then... Yeah, so moving on to some of the other characters in Gondor. Húrin the Tall, the Warden of the Keys. He's the gatekeeper of Minas Tirith. So like he's the one who's basically in charge of the city, whilst with the stewards. It's kind of obviously at this point Denethor has, well, the polite expression is he's lost his marbles. And so it's kind of like he's in charge of marshalling the defence of the city, whilst Aragorn and Gandalf and all that lot are off fighting at the Black Gate. Because obviously Faramir is still in the Houses of Healing, so he's not fit to command the city of Gondor. So that's kind of, again, it's one of those represented in his profile, but he's got the it's the line. I can't remember the exact name of the special rule, but essentially, if Aragorn or Denethor is your leader, he's fearless. But then it's the chain of command. So as long as Húrin's alive, your opponent will not get any victory points for killing the enemy leader in the game. So that's cool. Again, it's designed to represent his role as leader of the White City. He takes over if no one else can.
So if you were looking at a thematic army, who would Húrin actually be like the bodyguard for? Would it be Denethor, or can you also have him thematically with Elisar?
Thematically, yes, because of his special rule that he grants him. I think he's fearless within 3 inches of either Gandalf, Denethor, or Aragorn. So it's kind of it basically covers the 3 heroes that command the city of Minas Tirith. So you've got Denethor initially, and then obviously Gandalf commands the defense when Denethor's off tending to a wounded Faramir, and then obviously Aragorn becomes king, so you'd assume that Húrin would naturally defer to him as the overall leader. So it's designed to represent like the 3 leadership stages of Gondor, really. So it's also kind of one of those. There are some great stories in the history of Middle Earth. Again, going back to the lore, it's all about these characters who sort of, when there's no one else they can turn to for leadership, they rise up and become the leader. And so Húrin, he's not someone who has that responsibility thrust on his head. He's one of those who just says, right, no one else can lead these guys, so I'm going to. So it's a nice way of looking at that.
Is the Warden's sword mentioned at all in the books? Because that's an interesting rule they put in for him.
That one, I think, is a complete invention. I've not read it about anything like that in the books. In fairness, there's not many there's not a lot of weaponry in Lord of the Rings that gets a full detail. I mean, obviously you've got Andúril has quite a significant history. Obviously, it's originally Narsil. It cuts the One Ring off Sauron's hand. Aragorn, in the book, obviously, it's passed down by the heirs of Isildur until in the Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn embraces his destiny, has the sword reforged, and it goes off to war as Andúril. And that's kind of the only major weapon that does get covered. And then again, you've got the lesser weapons. You've got Gandalf's Glamdring, you've got Orcrist with Thorin, and obviously you've got Sting that Bilbo and Frodo both. And then the rest of the weaponry in Lord of the Rings, some of it gets a passing name. For example, you've got Theoden's sword, which is Hergwim, if you're interested. And then Airmir's sword, which is Guthuin. But other than that, swords aren't really that well named in Earth. It's only really Andúril, and that's the only one that's got an elaborate history.
So it's a shame actually that Theoden's sword got a special rule in the new edition, but maybe Éomer's didn't.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I think the sword Hergwim, I think, is passed down along the line of the Kings of Rohan, though. So that might be why it's been given. It's a sword that allows him to feint despite having a higher fight value, isn't it?
Or a lower one. So if he comes across a troll, fight 7, then you would normally have to stab, but that allows him to feint instead. So in the books, what point in history is Narsil reforged? It's not done in the timeline of the movies.
No, the way the movies portray Aragorn is kind of initially he doesn't want the responsibility of kingship. He's quite happy to be a ranger, whereas in the books, he's more than aware that he is the heir of Isildur, and he's kind of like, I've now got this chance. I think again it comes down to his whole relationship with Arwen. It's kind of he is in a relationship with Arwen in the books and in the films. It's kind of in the films he's kind of like, again, it's in the films it's the self-invented part that Arwen is dying, and so everyone has to kind of step up and embrace the kingship to kind of save her. It's kind of it's this classic damsel in distress scene, although it's kind of exaggerated slightly. Whereas in the books, Aragorn very much accepts, I'm the heir of Isildur, and now the time has come for me to embrace my destiny, become the king, and from that moment on, it's kind of it's all about Aragorn's. Most of the films, you kind of see Aragorn in the first film. He's a ranger, he's wise, and he doesn't want the power. You get into the Two Towers, and obviously he commands the defences of Helm's Deep, and you realise that he's a born leader. And then by the time you get to Return of the King, he embraces his destiny, and I have to admit his speech, like the whole Sons of Gondor, Rohan, my brothers, a day may come when the courage of men fails. It's definitely one of the best scenes in the trilogy, because you literally see at that point he's embraced his destiny. He's ready to lead this huge kingdom. He's accepted his responsibility, and he's ready to fight. So that's kind of it's a nice arc. It's a nice story arc to complete it for him.
So I last read the books, to my shame, when I was about 10 in primary school. Didn't quite appreciate the literary value of it at that age. But from what I vaguely remember, does Aragorn either have the broken sword on him and he shows that to everybody that he comes into contact with, or is it already reforged in Rivendell?
He shows it to the hobbits when he meets them in Bree. So he kind of shows off that, yeah, I've got this this is my broken sword. I'm planning to reforge it. So it's kind of like, I think by this point it's not really covered in the story. It's obviously by this point Aragorn knows about Frodo and the ring, and he kind of knows that yes, he's on a quest to destroy it, and he kind of accepts that, okay, this is my time. I've been a ranger hiding in the wilderness for years. The time's come to embrace my destiny and become king. So when they have the Council of Elrond, he does show the sword to Boromir, because at that point, of course, Boromir has no idea who he is. Despite Aragorn having fought for Denethor previously, he has met Aragorn before, but he was in disguise. And we can, if you want, we can discuss that a little bit later, because that's kind of, It's one of those profile. It's a profile that I think we did have a miniature for. We never actually got it in the game, so we can discuss that at a later point. But it's essentially after the Council of Elrond, Aragorn agrees to join the Fellowship, and that's when he has Narsil reforged as Andúril.
Okay, and so on to Iorlas. Is that a book character?
No, Iorlas, I think, is only a character that appears in the films. Essentially, he's a captain of the guard of the Citadel, and if you're wondering who he is in the films, if you remember the point when Gandalf rescues Faramir and his men from the ring wraiths, and they ride into the gates of Minas Tirith, he's the one with the blonde hair who pops up and saying, "Oh, Denethor knew that this doom was coming a long time ago." So it's kind of, I think the easiest way to describe him, I would normally say he replaces Beregond, but then you actually read the lore, and Iorlas is in the books. He's mentioned briefly. He's Beregond's brother.
Oh, really?
He's only mentioned in name. He doesn't actually appear physically as a character, but there is a reference from Bergil, who is Beregond's son, and he simply says, like, tall, strong men of Lossarnach, like my uncle Iorlas. And so you put two and two together. It's kind of like, oh, so Bergil is Beregond's son, so Iorlas has to be Beregond's brother. But it's interesting that Iorlas is from Lossarnach, because we don't have a background for Beregond. So it's entirely possible we could have seen an axeman of Lossarnach who was actually Iorlas. But again, that's kind of, he appears in the film, so it's more sense to base the character on that character.
Because I watched the films because I got slight hearing problems, so I watched with subtitles, and actually it does says Iorlas : his text. So that was the specific character name they had for him, even when they were doing the filming. And it's interesting to me that they would choose that name instead of Beregond or even Imrahil.
It is an unusual one, yes, although I think you might have to ask Peter Jackson for the reasoning behind that one. It could entirely be possible they just looked through the Return of the King for potential names and picked that one.
We're going to come back to that, actually, because Gothmog, the name for the orc leader, that is lifted from a ancient Balrog, isn't it?
It is the name of the Balrog in the events of the Silmarillion. He's kind of like, Gothmog is the chief of the Balrogs, who carries this enormous big black battle axe and this enormous whip, and he's like a awesome destructive power, and Gothmog is killed in the fall of Gondolin. But what you've also got in the Return of the King, it's essentially the Witch King has been defeated by Éowyn, and there is a reference to Gothmog in the text in Return of the King. And Gothmog is listed as the I think it's the Lieutenant of Morgul, and he's the one who commits the reserves. So like the Easterlings and the Candish troops, he commits them into the Battle of Pelennor Fields. But the one argument that goes on with the reference to Gothmog in the text is we don't actually know if he's an orc. It's entirely possible Gothmog could actually be one of the ring wraiths. It's with quite a few of the Tolkien characters, there is a bit of ambiguity as to actually who they are, what they are, because kind of, especially with evil characters, because sometimes it's just a name in the text. But recycling names is something that happens quite a lot in Tolkien's works. For example, there are a few characters you hear of in The Lord of the Rings. So, for example, the names Ecthelion, Denethor, Haldir, they all appear as different characters in the Silmarillion. But Haldir, and again, it's cleverly done, because in the Silmarillion, Haldir is a chieftain of men, whereas Denethor and Ecthelion are elves. So Denethor is he's an elf who he lives in Middle Earth in the very early years of the First Age, when the orcs start invading into the lands. And then Ecthelion obviously is he's like the head of the guard of Gondolin, and he's actually the one who kills Gothmog in the Silmarillion. So they actually kill each other in that fight. So it's kind of where it's these heroes that have done great deeds and legendary names, and it's kind of, I think it could be recycling the names, but in terms of it could just be. We all know what the Tolkien method of alliteration could be. It's literally it's the same name, just the letters have been slightly rearranged. So, which is it's a nice way of naming your heroes.
Well, if you go through the family trees in the appendices, he has written a huge amount of original names, and in the styles of the cultures that they come from. So there's Elvish names, there's Hobbit names, there's men names, and you can usually tell which race they're from just by reading them.
Yes, that is true, but I think we'll forgive him that, because when you're naming all of those characters, we'll certainly forgive him when you have to reuse a name or two.
So Denethor from The Return of the King is the second of his name, if I remember rightly. There's a Denethor before then in the line of stewards.
Yes, there's it's the same with Aragorn, because he's Aragorn the second. There was a previous Aragorn the first, who was an early chieftain of Dunedain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same with Boromir as well. Boromir is he's Boromir the second, and it's definitely the same for Faramir, because one of the last kings of Gondor, his son was called Faramir, and he basically gets killed when the Candish invade Gondor, and it's like the last true king of Gondor dies, and that's when sort of like the lesser houses start to rule Gondor.
And then Pippin names one of his children Faramir, so the name carries on.
He does. It's the same with Sam. He's with all his, I think it's 13 children. So there's a Frodo Gamgee. There's a Sam Gamgee. There's a Pippin Gamgee. There's a Merry Gamgee. So again, it's Sam's way of honouring his friends by naming his children after them. Although no, it's interesting. None of the Hobbit children were called Gandalf, so that's a shame.
No. Am I right in thinking also that Sam's family changed their surname to Gardner in the Fourth Age?
If they did, I've not read that, so that's possibly outside of my knowledge.
So the two from Rohan, Elfhelm and Deowine.
These are two really, really nice characters. In fairness, before Gondor War came out, I was saying for ages, Elfhelm will be a great character. Elfhelm will be a great character. He's a named character. They can add him into the story if they're expanding it. So I kind of went with that. So I was very pleased when Elfhelm basically came out, and I was like, yay, vindication. So no, Elfhelm is a really nice character. He's one of the marshals of the Riddermark. So I think Aemir is the third marshal of the Riddermark. I don't know if Elfhelm's assigned a number, but essentially he's the one who commands the Eored, which is the company of riders that Eowyn and Merry sneak themselves into. Uh-huh. And I could be wrong here, so feel free to correct me, but it's entirely possible that you can put Dernhelm into Elfhelm's warband. I could be entirely wrong there, but
give me 20 seconds. I've got the book in front of me. Right.
It would fit with the story if you could deploy Dernhelm in Elfhelm's warband at the start of the game. It would certainly fit the story. And if you want, whilst you're looking, I'll talk about Deowine. So Deowine is the chief of the Royal Guard. He is the out of all the Rohan Royal Guard, Deowine is the chieftain of all those guards. So he's basically the captain of the guard, and so that is essentially why he's got the special rules that give him an increased fight value when he's near Theoden, which that's part of Theoden's bonus. But obviously you've then got the free heroic combat that allows him to go nearer to Theoden if he can. So it's kind of, again, it fits in with the whole bodyguard thing.
Is there anything in the books about Elfhelm's spear throwing prowess, or is that a mechanism invented for the profile?
That's a mechanism invented for the profile. Again, we know like most of the Rohirrim, he's a prolific swordsman. He's a prolific horse rider. But his spear throwing abilities are they're not covered in the books. He's just a captain, and so I think with when you're creating like a named captain profile, you kind of need something that distinguishes them from the rest of the ordinary generic captains. So that's kind of the easy way. So it's kind of like with Madril, he's a captain of the Rangers, but he then gets bolstered with his Master of the Ambush special rule, which is absolutely fantastic in the scenarios where you need to roll for reserves. It really helps you out in the game. And it's the same with some of the Orc characters like Guritz, and again, it's a special, giving them a special rule that just sets them apart from normal generic captains. Because in theory, you could just take a captain of Rohan on horse with throwing spears and call it Elfhelm. But if you actually have the model with the benefit for the throwing spears, it makes the character more unique, and it really makes you want to include them in the game. So it's trying to match it to the profile when you don't have a lot of background to go on, but it also encourages you to want to take that character.
So that point leads us neatly to some of these were suggested by listeners, so thank you for taking part on the Facebook post. There are characters here such as, and I may butcher the pronunciation, Herluin, Mablung the Ranger, Galaskil, and Hergon. So is it a case of Gondor's already got a huge variety of heroes to choose from? Maybe it would be you'd dilute it too much by introducing too many named heroes for people to take? Or maybe are they holding something back for a release years down the line?
Honestly, I think it could be a bit of both, because if you suddenly introduce especially if you're introducing a new source book, if you're bombarding them with 20 different characters, it's going to be almost impossible for people to pick a single army. Because yes, you can introduce characters like Mablung the Ranger, and you can introduce maybe a few new fiefdoms heroes, but I think when you're introducing a new source book, especially after you've rewritten all the army lists, all the army books, essentially it could just trigger a complaint saying, oh, I've got the new rule book, but this new army book's just come out that's got 20 new profiles in it. So it's kind of like, why didn't they just put those in the army book? So it's kind of, you need to have a fine balance. It's entirely possible we could see characters like that introduced in future source books, but I think when you're doing a new source book, you're only going to be introducing probably a half a dozen new heroes for each side, so good and evil. You don't want to introduce tons of new characters straight away, because it's, again as well, because some of these have got special rules we've not seen before, like Ingold's shield wall special rule that they don't back away within 3 inches, and Elfhelm's spear throwing abilities. It's trying to introduce so many new profiles and so many new special rules straight away, especially after a big rule change. I think you kind of need to go with like a less is more approach. Otherwise, you're going to have way too many profiles, and people are going to be like, oh, there's way too many profiles. How am I going to build an army list? Or it's going to be like, it's literally, like, how am I supposed to, why bother doing an army book if you're just going to bring out a supplement with 20 more profiles? It's going to be a bit, and it's going to be hard to keep track of them all as well. If you've suddenly got all the profiles in one book, then you've got to bring along 10 different source books that have got another 50 profiles in them. So it's kind of, again, it's just balance, really, I think.
Fair point. Going with the Rohan, though, we've had it confirmed that the next source book will be War in Rohan. I think that's the way around it's going to be. So it got me thinking, well, we've just had some new Rohan profiles in Gondor at War. Who's left to create a profile for? So I thought you'd be the person to ask about that.
Honestly, if we, again, going back to Rohan at War and you're focusing on the Two Towers, there are not many. Potentially what we might potentially see with Rohan at War is, I don't know if we'll get new profiles. We might get some new profiles, and it makes sense we do. I think the obvious army lists I can think of, you'd probably cover things like you've got the Fords of Eisen battles. You might have raids in the Westfold. You'll obviously have the Siege of Helm's Deep, and you'll have the Ents attacking Isengard. So the likelihood is, and probably you've also got the Wrath of Rohan. we might introduce some new. There's some potentially new characters I can think of. Obviously, there's a rider who accompanies Airmare called Airthane. So he could be potentially maybe like one of Airmare's lieutenants. So he could get a profile, and maybe just one of like a scout rider, that sort of thing.
If I remember rightly, they borrow that name for the refugee child, don't they, in the film?
They do, yes. And so it's kind of I think that was just an easiest way to do it. It's kind of just to show how the raids on Rohan are affecting everyone. But yeah, in terms of new Rohan heroes for Rohan at War, there's not really a lot left to go through. So it's entirely possible they might invent a few profiles.
What about Quickbeam or Beachbone or the Horns for the Ents?
That is probably a possibility we should not rule out, especially if they end up doing the most a very, very likely legendary legion would be Last March of the Ents. So it'd probably be like Treebeard, Quickbeam, Beachbone, Ents, and potentially Horns as well. So yeah, there's definitely potential for a Last March of the Ents legendary legion. So we've already got the Ent army list, but expanding those profiles wouldn't be too difficult. The question is, it would be interesting to see if they went down the Forge World route is probably where that's going to go down. But it could be, if you've already got the plastic Ent kit, that they could potentially do like a Forge World upgrade kit that gives you additions to the plastic kit that helps you to make a Quickbeam or a Beachbone.
Good idea. So in the lore, what is the difference between an Ent and a Horn?
Horns are essentially they're trees that have they do have some form of sentience. They can move independently, but they are essentially they're shepherded around by the Ents. So it's kind of like you've got an ordinary tree which just stands there, does nothing, and then you've got Huons, which are kind of independent of themselves. They can move around, but generally they move around under the guidance of the Ents. It is entirely possible that the character of, again, this is straight from the Fellowship of the Ring, the book. There's a character in the Old Forest called Old Man Willow. He's the one who, again, this does appear in the extended edition of the Two Towers, where Merry and Pippin get trapped by a tree, and sort of Treebeard comes to rescue them. It could be that's an example of the Horns. Again, you do see them in the extended edition, where you see them moving away from Isengard, and they appear at the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep and beat the living daylights out of the remaining Uruk-hai. So it's just to recap, if you've missed it in all the rambling I'm doing, a Horn is essentially it's a sentient tree, but it doesn't have the ability to basically talk and move around independently like the Ents can. Humans, again, they can move, but they do require a lot of shepherding from the Ents. So that's essentially what a Huon is. So they probably would have a fairly basic profile. It's entirely possible we could just end up with terrain to represent them, and they don't actually move. It could be and it's an interesting way if they did go this way, would be to create it like a scenery kit, and if you end your movement in the trees, they could mistake you for an enemy and actually try to beat you up. We've not scenery that can attack you is more of an Age of Sigmar concept. It's not something you see in Middle Earth. So that's kind of, it's a way they could do it to represent the Horns, but it's possible that we'll get a profile and potentially a model for them. Or alternatively, you could just glue a tree to a base and call it a Huon, so it wouldn't matter that much.
So that's why there's a throwaway line in the Two Towers about Ents being shepherds of the forest.
Yes, essentially.
What about Helm Hammerhand as a profile?
That would be an interesting one, because obviously Helm Hammerhand, he's way back in the middle of the Third Age. But again, it's kind of like with Scouring of the Shire. Obviously, they gave us profiles for Ulrortuk, and they gave us back Golfimble, so you could recreate the Battle of Green Fields, and you can then add Golfimble into your Angmar army. And he's one who's not around at the time of the Lord of the Rings, but he is a historical character, and so with the with Helm Hammerhand, you do have. It's like with El the Young. You've got a character who could be added to the game for historical context, and Helm Hammerhand is he is a legendary hero of Rohan. It's kind of like, to give you a bit of background as to what happens. He's the king of Rohan when Rohan basically gets invaded by the wild men of Dunland, and he retreats to the fortress of Helm's Deep, and basically he goes out at night and beats Dunlendings to death with his fists. Hence the name Helm Hammerhand. It's not because he actually wields a hammer. It's because he goes out and beats them to death with his fists. And it's kind of like he goes out one night, they can't find him, and it turns out he froze to death. So it's kind of, I can understand where a Helm profile will come from. It's a fantastic character to add for in the context of heroic scenarios, because you could easily take Helm with Rohirrim and just like reenact the when Helm's Deep gets besieged by the Dunlendings, or say, for example, they've invaded Rohan and he rides out with his men to try and defeat them. So yeah, so the characters that are added for historical context are really, 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 really nice in my opinion, because it shows just how well they're invested in the lore of the games. So it really does enhance it, for my opinion.
So we're going to turn briefly to the evil side of Gondor at War, and we had loads of really good Mordor heroes introduced, as well as a scattering of others. So we've got Zagdush, Goroth, Guritz, Gothmog's Enforcer, Delgamar, and Raza. Are any of these based in the books, or are they, because Guritz and the Enforcer are obviously based on characters from the films, are the rest inventions for this source book?
The short answer is yes, they're all invented for the source book. That's kind of one of the things with Tolkien's writing. There are quite big gaps, especially when it comes to the evil factions. Especially for a lot of the evil forces, a lot of the named heroes have been invented. So, like with the various ring wraiths and their names, they've nearly all been invented. I think in his writings, Tolkien only ever names the Witch King of Angmar and Camul the Easterling. Those are the only ring wraiths that have got names. So, and you kind of get into the armies of the Easterlings. There's a few Easterlings in, say, for example, the Silmarillion who have names. I think there's one called Olfang and there's another one called Rodda. But when it comes to the events of the Third Age and Return of the King and Pelennor Fields, there's no real named evil heroes in the books themselves. You've got, obviously, the Witch King gets mentioned, Gothmog gets mentioned, and then of course you've got the characters like Shagrak, Gorbag, and a few others. But most of them, just no, the evil forces don't have any named characters whatsoever. So it's kind of a challenge for the game designers in many ways, because you've got to, if you want to come up with a named hero for a faction, you've got to, one, come up with a name that fits, and then of course you've got to try and invent a profile for them that would fit them into that particular army. And again, with characters like Guritz and Gothmog's Enforcer, they're kind of easier because you know those characters are in the film, so you can build on that based on what they do in the films. But with characters like Goroth and Zagdush and Raza and Delgamar, they are completely fictional. They don't exist in the books. They don't exist in the films. But what's really, really nice is the way they've designed the characters. They actually look like they could have taken part in the films themselves. I mean, I think it's Goroth, for example, the Morannon orc swinging the great big heavy mace, which is a really, really lovely model. But it's kind of, when you see a model like that, you could actually picture him taking part in the Siege of Gondor. You could actually see him fighting on the wall, swinging his mace, and it kind of, the characters that they've invented just do fit in really, really well with the army list. So yeah, definitely a merit point to Ben there.
So there's credit for coming up with names that fit, as we were saying, the aesthetic is not the right word, but the style of those different factions. And then, as you were also mentioning earlier, each of these new characters needs a kind of unique selling point for what they can do for a faction. So there's been some creativity coming up with all these different special rules for them. And I particularly like Goroth, for example, where when he gets a killing wound, he just drags an orc in front of him, and on a 2+ it saves the wound. Adds a lot of character.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. It's kind of like as well, you got Zagdosh, he's got his ability he can increase his strength but reduce his defense at the same time. So you can kind of go with the so he becomes a frenzied fighter on top of the walls, and essentially he can become more dangerous, but he's at more of a risk to himself. And again, I like Delgamar as well. So I used him at the Throne of Skulls doubles tournament, and he's a pretty decent character, and I do like the fact that he can whip fellow Corsairs into basically getting them to do better. Essentially, he's like his whips of it's not quite whips of the masters, but it's essentially it gives them a re-roll. But if they fail it, they get a strength 2 hit, which for a Corsair it does have the potential to kill them, because Corsairs don't exactly wear heavy armor. But again, it's kind of one. Again, it fits because like on board a ship, you can see like the masters whip the crew into basically doing what they want. So it fits in with the whole Corsair vibe. And again, Delgamar is an absolutely beautiful model. The Forge World models the quality of them is absolutely fantastic, and the detailing on them as well is superb.
And it also fulfills a function in as far as Corsairs don't have natural access to banners, so they rely on things like bosuns, which provide a banner effect, and Delgamar adds to that, which is useful for their high fight value in game.
Yeah, exactly. It does build into. Again, it's all about on the bug that essentially that if you need the crew to do something, either yell at them or threaten them with pain. That's kind of it's a very pirate way of doing things. So that's kind of, again, it fits in with the actual. It fits in with the nature of the characters themselves.
So to round off the look at Gondor at War, we're just going to have a quick go over of some of the book characters that are within the army lists in Gondor at War. So we're looking at things like Suladan, Imrahil, Forlong. Is Dalamir a lore character, or is he a creation as well?
He's also a creation because there's none of the Corsairs of Umbar around about the time of the events of Return of the King. There's no named Corsairs of Umbar. Again, this is kind of, if you're wondering where we're getting a lot of this information from, at the back of the Return of the King, the book, is a series of appendices, and Tolkien goes into details such as the lineage of the kings of Gondor. And so in that reference, there's a few, essentially where the Corsairs of Umbar spring from is Gondor essentially used to rule a very, very large portion of Harad. And Umbar was kind of like the chief city, and the Lords of Umbar rebelled in an event called the Kinstrife, which is where basically Gondor started turning on each other. And this is actually where the Black Númenóreans come from. So like the original Black Númenóreans were like the Lords of Umbar who rebelled against the rule of Gondor and the rule of Minas Tirith, and essentially wanted to become their own independent kingdom. So you get a few names in that respect, like the nobility of Gondor that rebelled against the actual kings. But in terms of Return of the King and the Battle of Penelfields, no, the Corsairs don't have any names. It's actually the same with Suladan. Suladan he's referred to as the Serpent Lord in the books, and I think the name Suladan itself is not mentioned in the Lord of the Rings. So again, the character exists, but it's kind of one of those where the name has been invented. It's kind of like, right, we need to, again, because Suladan was in the book, it was in the game from like the very start with I think it was either the Siege of Gondor profile, or more likely it was the Battle of Penelfields source book. And we're talking like in the very, very first days of the game, you're looking about 10 to 15 years ago when the first profiles came out. And so I think Suladan was added in that respect. And so, yeah, Suladan, the name itself is invented, but the character is 100% real.
Because there's a Harad cavalry section in the book, and they meet the riders of Rohan, and then Theoden kills the Serpent Lord.
Yes, he does. And I believe that is the horse and the serpent scenario in the Gondor at War campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you get to, what's really good is you get to recreate that scenario, because essentially it's like the cavalry, the Haradrim are there first. They basically fight Theoden, and Theoden kills Suladan in the game. Kills Suladan in the events of the book, and then Witch King arrives. Because the way they did it in the films, Suladan doesn't make an appearance. It's literally the Mumakil turn up, essentially. So yeah, the Rohirrim charge into the orcs, and then they drive them back, and then the Mumakil turn up, and that's the whole thing. And then in the midst of it, it's like Theoden tries to rally his men, the Witch King turns up and kills Theoden. Whereas in the books, the battle plays out slightly differently in that the Rohirrim charge in, the Haradrim try to engage Theoden and the Rohirrim, but they absolutely get walloped. Suladan, like the character that is named Suladan in the game, gets killed by Theoden, and then they mistake Suladan for like the leader of the forces of Mordor. And then obviously once he's dead, the Witch King arrives, and that whole mess comes up. And then the Mumakil themselves turn up later and don't actually have that much of an impact on the battle as they do in the films. But I can completely understand why they added the Mumakil. They just used the Mumakil in the films, because that whole Battle of Plenelfield scene where you've got the Rohirrim arrives, Theoden delivers that absolutely spine-tingling speech, the whole ride to ruin and the world's ending. It's absolutely it has to be my absolute favourite scene in the entire film series. So you're including the Hobbit trilogy as well. Like the charge of the Rohirrim at the Plenel Fields and the arrival of the Mumakil, just the whole Battle of the Plenel Fields itself is just because it just looks absolutely epic to watch. It's a fantastic series of films.
CGI still holds up today in a lot of places. So
yes, they did. Sorry, yeah, I think they use the CGI a lot better in Lord of the Rings than they did in the Hobbit trilogy. But that's probably something for another podcast.
Fair enough. So we did already cover where the Gothmog name came from, and the fiefdoms we covered right at the start of the podcast. So we're going to skip on to what characters from the books and the wider lore would you want to see? Because I've got scribbled down 2 characters that get one mention right at the end of the Return of the King book, and those are Landroval and Meneldor the Swift, who are eagles. And like the Ent list, I think the eagles could potentially do with having a couple of named characters.
Yeah, a few extra characters wouldn't go amiss, because at the moment, yes, the list is only comprised of it's Gwaihir and eagles, basically. So, yeah, I like the idea of adding a few named heroes to potential lists. If I had to name 2 things that I would like to potentially see added, the first one, which is going to sound strange, would be the Candish armies, because, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, either CJ if you want to correct me wrong, or if there's people who can post comments below, because obviously will be on YouTube. I don't actually think honestly think the Candish army list is the only army list in the entire game that doesn't have a name, to use the phrase, named hero. So obviously you can argue Far Harad doesn't have one either, but you've got the Mumak war leader. So you can technically pretend that he's a named hero. But in terms of an actual named hero with special rules, like it would be an invented backstory, but I don't think the Candish army list has a named hero. So it would be interesting to see if they go down that route and sort of create a named hero for the Candish. It'd be interesting to see what special rules they do. And the other one I'd like to see is it's actually King Brand and the Men of Dale, because this kind of leads into a whole new potential source book, and that is essentially it's the War of the Ring itself. Because whilst you've got the Siege of Gondor, you've got the Black Gates, and you've got the Pelennor Fields, going on at the same time, there's a whole host of other battles that take place around about the same time. You've got orcs make assaults upon Lothlorien. You've got, obviously, there's war under the boughs of Mirkwood. You've got the siege and ultimate destruction of Dol Guldur. And then you've got the massive siege of Dale and Erebor by the Easterlings. So I think someone has put a comment on the Facebook page about an old Dane profile. So again, we can look at that in more detail when we come to the questions. But yeah, it's sort of characters like King Brand and like the Men of Dale around about the time of the events of Return of the King. Because we're only briefly introduced to Dale at the start of The Hobbit. So you kind of got all you've got is you've got Girion, you've got a captain of Dale, and you've got the warriors of Dale. So it'll be interesting to see like how far Dale has come as an army list by the events of the War of the Ring. And then obviously you've got the dwarves of Erebor as well, which again may have differed very much from they did in the time of the Hobbit. Because again, 60 odd years on, their army lists may have changed. I don't think you're going to see goat riders charging into Eastlings, but it'd be interesting to explore that region of the lore. So,
am I right in thinking that the Beornings are also involved in that fight?
Entirely possible. It could be that they get involved into the scraps in Mirkwood, because obviously at the time of the War of the Ring, it's Grimbeorn, which is Beorn's son. So yeah, having Grimbeorn and the actual Beornings themselves, because we don't actually know anything about them. We don't know if are they just ordinary villagers, or are they're skilled woodsmen, are they skilled hunters, that sort of thing. So again, there's a lot of potential for characters and just some regular troops. You could have, for example, the ordinary warriors of Dale, but you could also have maybe by this time they've got not exactly elite guards, but they could potentially have sort of like a group that's sworn to protect the king, which is kind of like any sensible army has a group of dedicated soldiers to protect the king. So it would be interesting to see them go down that route. But I think it might be a while before we see them cover something like that.
They could have wind lance siege weapons, or maybe fire arrows off the shoulders of small boys.
That would be interesting, yes.
I seem to recall that in the Legions of Middle-earth book, which has a lot of profiles that they said they were going to look at and then dropped, werewolves, for example, I think for the Khans, they did actually get a named hero called Kivizu or something of that nature, with the subtitle The Ravager of Ithilien. Or that might have been a White Dwarf article I'm remembering. Is this ringing any bells for you?
It sounds familiar, but yeah, unfortunately, I can't remember the name. But yeah, like I said, it'll be interesting to see if they ever did do a named hero. Because again, it kind of goes back to historical scenarios that take place before the events of Lord of the Rings. Because again, Tolkien has written a complete history of the Third Age and details certain events like the fall of Arnor and its invasion by Angmar, and like the various invasions of Gondor from like the north and the south. So again, there is potential for them to do sort of maybe source books or profiles based on those events, but again, it's kind of, I think they're more likely to focus on events of Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit first before they kind of go into things that take place outside the timeline of the films. So, but again, there's an awful lot of potential there. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see where the game goes in the next few years.
Final question for this section: who is Orofin?
If I remember right, Orofin, I think, is the brother of Haldir and Rumil.
Mm-hmm.
and he essentially he just appears as an elf in Lothlorien. Literally, we're only introduced to here's Arufin. This is Rumil. This is Arufin. He's my brother, and I think, if I remember right, Orofin goes away to help repel the orcs who are chasing after the Fellowship. And rather interestingly, I am actually doing a list based around this for Throne of Skulls in December. So I've got a Wood Elf Sentinel who I'm going to use to represent Arufin. So that should be
nice. So how come we got a profile for Rumil but not Orofin?
That's one, I think, is one you might have to ask the game designers. Again, it's kind of like, possibly because I think that this Fellowship spends more time with Haldir and Rumil, because they essentially guide them into Lothlorien, whereas Arufin has already gone off. So it's kind of, I think, because you can potentially flesh out more detail with characters who they spend a bit more time on, that could be why they picked Rumil as a profile.